end user, you need to recognize that everyone has a unique perspective, and those perspectives are shaped by the experiences, the roles, the privileges. Basically, who you are determines what you know about the world, right? We need to understand what matters most to them. Like, that's very important. We empathize with our users, but how about the people that we work with? Reducing anxiety of the stakeholders. That's something that they value, right? They need to trust that the product is going to work for them. It's not going to hurt their business, their reputation, their brand reputation, their company's image. Those are things that are beyond technical specs. My mentor once told me, if you're sitting at a table and nobody's hearing you, then you're at the wrong table. Being ready for a senior role isn't just about doing more of what you're currently doing. It's about moving on to more strategic initiatives. It's about, like I said, mentoring others, influencing bigger decisions.
Hi, Yilmaz. Thank you again for coming back. And today's topic of discussion is different companies in UX industry and also different job types like contract, if whatever they name it. So before we jump into deep discussion, for people watching, can you give us a little bit your introduction or background working with different companies and job types?
Yeah, thanks for having me, first of all. My name is Yilmaz Kulahoglu. I've been in the UX field for about 9 years. I'm currently based in Chicago, the United States, and I'm working at a consulting company. When it comes to industries that I worked in different industries, but I think my main experience is in finance, healthcare, and logistics.
So, an interesting question when you said finance, healthcare, and logistics, they're completely different industries, right?
Yes.
Like, I have a question out of curiosity. For a UX designer, it's not like a software developer who have to be very good at specific skill set. For UX, it's just like one skill set. Our tools keeps changing. So, is the transition between industries like finance, healthcare, and logistics, they are on opposite sides. So, is the transition easy?
There are differences and similarities when
Mhm.
you're doing on different industries. So, when it comes to similarities, usability is usability everywhere. Trust, you need to build some trust with users, and you need to be working towards transparency. It's always important, no matter which industry you go to. Users need to feel confident that the system that they're interacting with is easy to use, and the information that you're presenting to them is trustable. So those certain things don't change, but there are, of course, key differences too
Mhm.
when it comes to what is valued in these companies, different industries. For example, in logistics, it's mostly about operational efficiency, making sure systems are accessible to workers, and these workers will likely have different levels of familiarity with tech, and they will likely have different kinds of infrastructure that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So those are important factors in logistics. Healthcare, as everybody knows, you're handling sensitive personal data. So again, building trust with users is very important. Making sure access to care is simple, making sure it's straightforward. And when it comes to finance, different levels of financial literacy across users. So you just need to make sure users can access the right tools and technology to manage something very important in their lives, their money. These are like the similarities in my experience in different industries. But the other thing, which we talked about, the similarities between these, no matter which industry you go to, there is trust and the transparency. I think one important point is to think about, as a UX professional, think about your positionality, basically how your own background and how your own perspective is affecting your decisions. So you got to recognize how the context that you're in and the power dynamics are in each of these industries. What I mean by that is, as a designer, you're making interventions in a system. So whether it's you as a designer or the end user, you need to recognize that everyone has a unique perspective, and those perspectives are shaped by the experiences, the roles, the privileges. Basically, who you are determines what you know about the world, right? So it's about understanding where you and others that you're working with are coming from and how that influences your biases, ultimately how that influences the design that you're working on. Maybe to make it more concrete, like an example from healthcare domain. If you've never been in a vulnerable situation when it comes to healthcare, it's important to remember that your experience of healthcare systems might be very different than a user who is in a vulnerable situation, because you might take certain things for granted, like how easily you can access your medical records, how easily you can navigate online medical portals, or how easily you can understand the medical terms. But for that patient, these tasks might create a sense of anxiety, sense of being overwhelmed. So that is telling you that the design needs to prioritize clarity and ease of use. So basically what I'm saying is you need to acknowledge your own background, acknowledge the expertise of the users that you're designing for and their background, their situation. That's the way to improve systems through design.
So I have an interesting question. When you said like in a B2B situation, you just don't have access to the end user. It's not easy. Maybe it's an employee of a different companies. When you mention like ability to understand user perspective, generally when you're in a B2B, like it's very hard to get out of the building because you're getting into another building. It may be B2B2B, it may be a chain before it reaches the end user, your
Yeah.
product. So how do you exactly understand the mentality apart from it's basically mostly assumptions? You don't know after 6 months was the effect, but that is too late. You have to again, and with the emerging technology, now the technology is crazy with the AI and the next level.
Yeah.
So how do you empathize, as you were mentioned in the example, right? You have
Mhm.
no idea who is using it at the end, and you can't even say the expertise because there may be different user roles. Someone can be a doctor who is in a vulnerable situation who immigrated to a different country. Example, someone from Europe coming to US. Is it again? It depends upon if they're in Germany, free healthcare. Ireland is a different. If they come to US, it's a different healthcare system.
Yeah.
So it's impossible. But how do you deal with that situation as a UX designer when working on B2B?
Yes, specifically B2B it brings a level of complexity. Mostly, if I generalize, B2B products have higher complexity. So when you're working on them, you have to, like you said, get familiar with specific business domains, specific geographies, its technicalities, because you're designing tools for professionals in a particular industry. That means you need to gain a deeper understanding of how their world works. It's to say that users in B2B contexts are more specialized.
Mm-hmm.
So those users will have specific goals, they will have specific needs according to their job roles. And you need to keep in mind that this is a limited audience compared to B2C, because in B2C, you're usually targeting a broader audience. Of course, there are exceptions too, but again, if I had to generalize, some of the things that you mentioned in your question, I think is related to one key difference that I see working in B2B versus B2C, that especially when it comes to the difficulty of user research or reaching out to users. One thing in B2B is that your users are not always the same as your customers. So like the people using the product that you're working on aren't necessarily the ones making the purchase decision. In B2B context, you might see really big purchase funnels with a lot of people involved. Like, for example, a company's leadership might choose a tool or based on cost or based on the business needs, but the actual users of that tool or the employees will have different priorities and pain points, probably. And I think this creates a challenge that no one should overlook, because you need to design for the user's needs, but you also have to understand that the customer might have different motivations and needs. We talked about complexity. The other thing I think in B2B is lots of stakeholders. It's a multi-stakeholder environment. Just to give an example to that multi-stakeholder environment, one time we were running a journey mapping workshop. It was the first years of my career. We were running a journey mapping workshop at the client side. And of course, our goal was to get real users in the room, the people who were actually working with the product on a daily basis. But during the recruitment, the account managers and the stakeholders on the client side were insisting on having more managers in the workshop, the managers who don't really use the product on a daily basis. So this kind of tells you the different dynamics of B2B world, because you're usually navigating different layers of and levels of people with different needs and goals. So you have to keep that in mind, right? Your users' goals and your customers, the decision makers who approve the purchase of the product that you're working on. These people usually carry some, want to say, they have
their own agenda or something.
like cost, the agenda, like cost, efficiency, return on investment. What really helped me in this context, understanding like these different motivations, these different needs, I definitely recommend the B2B Elements of Value framework by Bain Consulting. I find it really useful because it really talks about what stakeholders value in B2B environments, because often it goes beyond just price or technical specs or functionality of the product. It's also, there are emotional needs, there are subjective elements that influence the buying decisions or how people use B2B products, which often overlooked in B2B settings. So I think that's a very good tool to understand that kind of what creates value in B2B. And then the difficulty of running user research in B2B environments, like you mentioned. These are the things that I was talking about, like the emotional, the subjective needs. These are things that are not easy to uncover through just typical research sessions. And they have big impact on how the product or the service is being used. So you need to do really careful research planning. You need to do careful research planning when you have the chance to run research. But there is also the difficulty of getting the buy-in for research to begin with. How do you get that buy-in at multi-stakeholder environments, especially if you're in an enterprise? Now we're talking about bureaucracy as well.
Yeah.
So you'll hit a lot of roadblocks when you're trying to run research, because there are so many layers of approvals, so many layers of decision making. And on top of that, it wouldn't be surprising if there's a huge disconnect between the user feedback and the product team.
Mhm.
I've seen this a lot. User feedback comes from many different ways, some formal ways, some informal methods. And by the time it gets to the product team, it gets filtered, it gets subjectified, for lack of a better term, by multiple stakeholders. And a way to see this, a way to diagnose this, is tracing back how an idea becomes a feature on the roadmap.
Mhm.
there you can see that disconnect. The other challenge when you're trying to run research in these settings is you might be working on a team.
Assumptions, like mostly, that's my experience. Very hard to get the users, and sometimes you get the users, but they would be handpicked. They're like very handpicked expert users,
Yeah,
and there's a huge bias like introduced anyway, even though you get hold because they're handpicked by the stakeholders and agenda. I won't say it's like an Machiavellian agenda or like political. It's someone like everyone has their own set of targets. You're working with
yeah,
B2B, I would say it would be mostly cross-functional working. Am I right?
it
Compared to
is. Yeah.
B2C. And to be honest, you'd be very lucky to get to test it with end user. Am I right?
It's, yeah, because the user population is much smaller, right? Like they're all, like we talked about, they're very specialized. So there's a smaller pool to get those users from. And there's a lot of course, especially enterprise settings, a lot of bureaucracy, politics, people with conflicting interests.
Yeah.
And it's also not surprising working in a team that is non-strategic, very output focused. They might have these output focused roadmaps that have already been planned for the long term. And when you're in those situations, good luck shifting the focus when the teams are locked into delivering specific features rather than responding to your research findings. It's very difficult, but there are things that you can do, of course. And this will not come as a surprise. I definitely find building strong relationships with stakeholders very important. But you need to also be mindful about who are you building those strong relationships with. Like they need to be the right people, that they need to be the key stakeholders who can become champions for your findings, for your research, who can, when you present your insights, who can make them more impactful, who can amplify them. And it's also something that a lot of people talk and a lot of UX leaders talk about, which I strongly agree that we need to also empathize with the people that we work with. We need to understand what matters most to them. Like that's very important. We empathize with our users, but how about the people that we work with?
Yeah.
And of course, you need to tie your research questions. When you plan your research, you need to tie those research questions to business outcomes. Can the business take action with the insight that you're going to uncover with your research? I think the answer to that question is very important.
So generally the difference for UX working from B2B and B2C is the mindset difference. For B2C is more like, okay, can I, like an original UX designer hard to fix the user, delight and those stuff. For B2B, it's more, let's say it's a business mindset, like very strategic mindset. It's like,
Yeah.
do you agree with that? It's mostly like,
It is business mindset, but like I mentioned, if you check that the framework from being consulting, it goes beyond that, right? It's not as straightforward as what B2C customers value when you have a broader audience. But there are things like, I think they talk about reducing anxiety of the stakeholders. That's something that they value, right? They need to trust that the product is going to work for them. It's not going to hurt their business, their reputation, their brand reputation, their company's image. Those are things that are beyond technical specs. It's a business mindset, yes. But
also being a therapist at the same time, like, understanding, setting the boundaries, understanding, but like
yes,
also applying business. I think like UX would only sit around 60%, 40% would be have you manage so you can do your UX work. Whereas that's not the case. And am I true or
it is hard to give it a percentage, but it really depends on the company that you work at, their understanding of UX. In some situations, yeah, you need to do a lot of expectation management. And I guess when it comes to empathizing with the people that you work with, yeah, there's an aspect of just being kind of therapist for them, just understanding, inquiring about what they value, what matters most to them. It's a intentional, deliberate conversation for sure.
So, just to throw a spin on the conversation, from B to C, the product delivery and everything is much more faster. Whereas B2B, the pace is very slow. So, we're talking about average, if we take in an average medium sized company, UX maturity, right? So, let from here, how does it change? Like B2B is already hard. How does it change for a company with like very low UX maturity? Or how do you know if you join a company, that company can be like for years? How do you know it has a very low UX maturity, especially in a B2B setting?
I think low UX maturity in B2B or B2C, they'll show very similar traits in my experience, in my opinion. In low UX maturity companies, you'll usually find a big disconnect between what you bring as a UX professional and what stakeholders think why you're there in terms of what they think you're there to do. And in these environments, it can feel like you're constantly trying to prove your value, which is pretty tough. And when it comes to your question of how do you understand the maturity level, UX maturity level of these companies, for me, it really comes down to two things. Is UX seen as a discipline, right? Does it get the same respect and trust that other disciplines like engineering or data do? And this will directly impact whether you get the resources that you need, like the time, budget, whether you get the support that you need. So it directly impacts your work. The second thing is, are people that you're going to be working with open to having their opinions challenged, especially when it comes to their assumptions about the users? So those two things are key in low UX maturity environments, whether B2B or B2C. I see them as a common thing.
I know it's like very sensitive question to ask. I recently overheard a conversation and I talked to a few people. So I'm really confused after talking. Sometimes a company based on the UX maturity is low, basically the environment can get toxic very easily. How do you know if you have a chance to actually improve the maturity of the company? Or is the company just toxic? There is nothing you can do and when to jump the ship. How do you know that difference?
Yeah, it's a
Right.
big question. It's a big question for sure. So I think first of all, there the reality there are lots of companies with low UX maturity. How do you improve the UX maturity? How do you know what to low hanging fruits in those situations? It reminds me of one of the podcast episodes of Jesse James Garrett and Peter Marholes. They had a guest who talked about the two extremes
Mhm.
of the mature, like very low, very high, and what to target in those situations. And this is assuming that you have the chance to choose, because sometimes we don't. You have teams or organizations that already get what UX is, they understand the value. So it's a no-brainer why you would want to work with them. But on the other hand, he was talking about the teams, the very low end, the extreme end. The teams that are struggling, they're usually desperate for a new approach because whatever they've been doing is not working. And usually in those situations, those teams could be more accepting when you target them because they have nothing to lose than trying something new. And I find this as a brilliant approach because when you try to work with organizations in the middle, when things are working, good or bad, like they're usually things are working. There's nothing to fix. The toxicity working in a low maturity environment. I think we need to be very careful about our expectations. We need to be realistic. Yes, UX maturity is very important, but let's think of highest level of UX maturity. We have all these different models of UX maturity out there, right? When you look at the highest level, you usually see every decision is made from a human-centered perspective. Design is in the fabric of everything this organization does. Honestly, I don't think many companies reach that standard. I don't know if you think of any, but it's a tough bar to meet, in my opinion. I think there's a simple explanation to this, and Erica Hall talks about this often. You should follow her. How we need to think critically about the value exchange in our economic system. So this kind of thinking can help us set our expectations about UX maturity. So what she says is basically a lot of big companies, big businesses, like highly financialized, they're not operating under the straightforward rule of more user value brings more business value, right? Like it's not an equation. But us as designers, we always think of this equation as take this as a truth, just as straightforward. Let's not pretend that every organization and every leader out there is focused on society's best interest. They're not.
Yeah.
And coming back to that environment, working in that environment, how does that feel? My mentor once told me, if you're sitting at a table and nobody's hearing you, then you're at the wrong table. So that's important to keep in mind. Like when you're assessing a company, it's sometimes not about the whole company. We can sometimes think about finding little pockets in these companies where we can get the traction that you're looking for. And there are certain things you can ask to figure that out, especially when you're doing your job search, when you're in an interview. Like one of the things you can ask, if you're going to be an order taker, or will you have a say in the strategic conversations? Will you have a seat in that famous strategic table? Are you going to be able to ask big questions like, why did we decide to go with option A instead of option B? And I'm talking about like a strategy, not necessarily tactical decisions.
Mm-hmm.
If you're, let's say you're interviewing with a company, you can ask the hiring manager, can you share some examples of any successful partnerships between product and UX? How did they collaborate? How did these teams collaborate? How did they reach to a shared outcome? I think that question can reveal a lot about this aspect of maturity. The other thing is pretty straightforward. Are users involved in the process? It's an important question to ask. Are going to be users involved in the UX, or are we just working on the X? Are we responsible for creating an experience based on subjective opinions? Because there's always going to be an experience, even if you want to involve the users, the experience. You can ask, can you share some examples of how user research influenced specific features, how it influenced product development? That's a straightforward question to ask. And it will also reveal if this company is sensitive to product waste, as in just churning out features. You can ask the interviewer about one of their most recent releases, how it's moved from ideation to market. That will also reveal a lot about the maturity of the company. So I think all these questions, and there could be many more, that you can carefully craft these questions before your interviews to assess the company's maturity.
So that's an interesting thing. So one of the things, you have to get an opportunity to assess in the interviews. These are the questions you ask mid to senior, or as you go to senior lead, those are the questions you ask to assess the maturity. But one of the interesting thing is, if you see, even for a junior role, you have to have 5+ years of experience. For senior, 15+. I just don't understand. Can you expand on it? My take is, if someone can sit in one company, like you can't grow if it's a matured company. Okay, you build a product from the scratch. 2 years, maybe with this technical advancement, like it would be outdated soon. then you would be mostly like a support designer until you're building on a different products from the scratch, which most of the companies, I have a high question like they're doing that. It would be like changing or reworking, but it's not every day that rebuilding like whole softwares.
Sure.
So
Sure.
I'm really confused like with this method. Someone can sit in a company for 4 or 5 years.
Right.
Can they be called a senior when they're like literally being a support designer, supporting features, fixing the stuff? Or is the years of metric does really matter? From my experience, a senior is a person who has more opportunities to work on different projects or experiment a lot. Whereas a mid or a junior is they don't have that many opportunity. You can create an opportunity to get to the seniority level based on the experience. As I said, you can sit there 9 to 5, work 2 hours, take the paycheck, same salary, 5 years, boom, you're not senior when you're moving on. So, how do you deal with this one? Because the current job market is very tough, and now the years of experience gone up. The salaries, I'm not, salary is another topic we can talk about it, but just the experience part. So, what's your take on it?
I agree with your analysis of if you're a junior team member, you're likely not going to have a very big ownership of complex project platforms. But you need to find growth opportunities. I think it's not a good strategy when you wait for someone else to hand them to you. If you want to grow as a UXer, you need to be able to take initiative and find these growth opportunities in the companies. It's very, of course, it varies from company to company if they have the necessary structures for you to find those opportunities. Depends on the team. It depends on your manager. A lot of it depends on your manager. We can talk about the manager ceiling and all of those different factors come into play. But the other thing you mentioned, the years of experience, I think I have a lot to say about that one. Someone, how do they say, I have 5 years of experience, this many years of experience? Yeah, people will talk about that. It's a factor. You put that on your resume or whatnot. But I feel like it's too big of a factor in the UX job market because of our lack of standardization. There's a huge gap in what counts as UX experience in our industry. Let's look at an example of, let's say, someone working as a graphic designer at a marketing agency. They might say, I have design experience, just using that word design, which is pretty different than someone who's been in the trenches of product development, working on complex systems or software with multidisciplinary teams. And so this creates a big gap in the quality of UX experience. If you just use the number as years of experience, you might see them as equal, but there's a big difference. And let's also not forget the maturity of the organization people work at also plays a big role in the quality of their experience. Like you could have 5 years of experience at a high maturity company that really focuses heavily on user-centered processes. And that's very different 5 years than someone who was working at a low maturity company being basically a mock-up monkey, just churning out mock-ups. So because of that, I think the years of experience is a pretty misleading measurement. It's like the vanity metric of UX recruitment. It looks impressive on paper, but it doesn't always tell the whole story, right? It I've seen it creating frustration for many people, for candidates, for companies. I've seen it leading to wrong hiring decisions because, again, it doesn't really reflect the quality of someone's experience. And you might, of course, ask, is there a better metric? Yilmaz? Like, why? Okay, what is better than years of experience? And that would be a very fair question, to be honest, because I wish there was. I wish we had some kind of governing body that could assess skill levels consistently across the fields. I wish more leaders talked about this, the lack of this governing body. It's a huge problem, right? This lack of standardization in UX. If you look at fields like architecture, for example, they need to get certified regularly. They need to, if they want to level up their career, they need to get approvals from certain institutions like architectural boards, registration boards, or what have you. And that makes sense when you're working on $1 million projects as an architect.
Mm.
You need that level of accountability. But the projects we do in UX can have just as much high impact and can carry just as high financial risks if mistakes are made. Think about a poorly designed user experience in finance. Think about the cost of errors in those systems. They could be easily in millions. And think of all the human impact of all this social media and other platforms that have been designed. So we're talking about the same impact, but a huge gap in standardization. And I think if you ask me if there's a better metric, that's the reason why I can't answer that question.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very interesting. So, yeah, that's the wrong metric. Yes, it may be an important metric, but it depends upon the context on where they're
Mhm.
coming from. So, I think we came to the end of the podcast episode. So, based on our discussion on the UX maturities, B2B, B2C, getting numbers of years of experience being a barrier, the key takeaway for a person trying to change industry or trying to progress or just trying to shaken up their world and just go to a different industry or a better company. So, what is your key takeaway they need to be looking for?
So if they want to, just to make sure I understand the question, if they want to grow as a designer,
As a
um,
designer and change industries, maybe.
at major industries,
Yes.
yeah, I think, like we mentioned at the beginning, it's really important to understand the differences, but also the similarities across different industries. I understand why someone would want to get exposure to different industries just for their own career development and open up more opportunities for them.
Mhm.
But you always need to understand the domain, right? It doesn't happen overnight. Understanding specific constraints of that domain and the business acumen. And when you talk about growing as a senior designer, you need to understand if you're ready to make the shift from tactical tasks to more strategic initiatives.
Mhm.
If you're able to work on multiple products with working with multiple stakeholders. And again, that also depends on the UX maturity of the company, but ownership of complex projects are often a good sign of you are ready for the next level as a senior designer. You also need to be able to handle ambiguity, handle complex challenges. This is like a very discussed topic. Another thing is you just see if you're currently guiding and supporting new team members, junior team members. Are you fostering a growth in the team? That's another sign that you're ready for it. And yeah, I think those would be my like the key takeaways. I guess when it comes to UX maturity, really make sure you understand as much as possible the maturity of the environment that you're getting into, because this can sometimes make or break your career. If a company doesn't understand or doesn't respect UX, you might end up as an order taker, not influencing decisions, and you might work in an environment that is not desirable. And this experience can teach you a lot of valuable lessons, but keep in mind that it can also hurt your growth and hurt your career, because in those environments, you will not be given the support or the resources to do your best work. That's very important. And you need to understand, especially if you're ready to move to a senior position, there are different paths. One of them is not better than the other. There is individual contributor paths, there is people management paths. You need to understand them, what they mean for your day-to-day work, because being ready for a senior role isn't just about doing more of what you're currently doing. It's about moving on to more strategic initiatives. It's about, like I said, mentoring others, influencing bigger decisions.
Oh, one key takeaway I just want to expand. You said like in order to jump from one industry and other industry, it doesn't happen overnight and you have to get a domain knowledge. How do you get that domain knowledge?
Desk research has always been helpful. The people that you work with, you need to, again, build relationships with them, just seek knowledge. You need to be a researcher for your own sake to understand that domain. You need to also, like everything else, you need to prioritize things pretty carefully, right? How much time investment are you going to put into understanding the specific thing? What is going to be the return of learning that specific technicality about this domain? What will that bring to your work? It's important to assess these things because it's easy to get lost in rabbit holes when you're trying to understand a business domain, especially talking about like government sector, finance, same thing, healthcare in the US. That's just like insanely complex, unnecessarily complex. Yeah, it takes time and you need to be pretty smart about the things that you want to learn about that industry.
Do you think like apart from Googling, ChatGPT, YouTube, the other best way is actually making human connections with people who are actually working in the industry and maybe working fake projects to understand the complexity, checking in with them. Do you think that would be a better to build a portfolio is that doing a transition at the same time to understand a domain from a person who's actually worked on this project? Do you think that would be a good approach? Actually building human connections, getting mentoring.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the importance of building relationships. You're going to be working with people in this new industry. Even if you're a junior resource, you're going to be working with people. It's likely that you'll be working with maybe a product owner, a junior product owner, a junior developer who has been in the field for a long time, longer than you. So building that relationship with them, asking targeted questions about this domain. I've had a lot of positive experiences whenever I change my industry. I think that the wrong approach here is to start working in isolation from those other people, just trying to learn everything by yourself without asking questions. A lot of the times, the reaction when you ask these questions is going to be positive because people will see that curiosity from you as a new person in this domain. So I think it's in my experience, again, I don't want to generalize. It's been usually a positive experience when I go speak with people. It's timing is important. You can't just work in an industry for 1 year, not asking the important questions, and then after 1 year asking a very simple question. That, of course,
Yeah.
not going to create a positive reaction, but the timing, yeah, like you got to be curious and willing to learn from the get go.
Perfect. I think we had a wonderful conversation today and I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much. Thanks, Ilmaz.
Thank you for the great conversation. Take care.